Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Have a Life Teaching podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about charter schools, particularly the growth of charter schools as a viable alternative to the traditional public school that maybe you went to as a student and your family before that. Charter schools really are an opportunity now to provide students who might not have originally had a choice in where they went to school with the option to go to a school that's a quality environment for that child's learning. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that charters, as opposed to public schools or as opposed to private religious schools or independent schools, are in and of themselves better, but they do provide a potential opportunity for positive learning environments, particularly in urban districts where traditionally students might not have had those options. Now, with that said, though, how do we ensure that charter schools and other new schools, but mainly charter schools, are indeed those schools that are going to offer our students quality learning environment? So that's why I'm really excited today to have as my guest David Greenberg, who is the Vice President of Authorizer Learning Development with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, or NACSA. So David, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, John.
So David, one thing I really like to ask all my guests when they come on the show is, how did you, if not so much how you got involved in education, but how did authorizing of charter schools become your area of interest?
Yeah, that's we joke about that in the world of authorizing that, oh yeah, I grew up wanting to be a charter school authorizer. I don't know if I've run across any of my colleagues or friends who have said that. But I was a charter school developer. I taught in a traditional school district here in St. Paul. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minnesota happens to be the birthplace of charter schools. The first charter school opened back in 1992, and so I taught in St. Paul at the traditional district. And I was part of a group of folks. We were fortunate to implement sort of a unique arts integrated bilingual program. I taught in the Spanish immersion program at the high school there, and we had a lot of successes and also felt a lot of limitations as big school districts often, don't allow us to do all the types of things we want to do, implement innovative curricula and all that kind of stuff. Long story short, a couple artists and a couple teachers, we got this idea to start a charter school. We just learned about charter schools. We were fortunate to go to a meeting where we learned more about how to do it, how to start a school. Long story short, we started a school. And to start a school, you have to get the appropriate agency to authorize you. So that was the first experience I had with an authorizer. At the time, they were called sponsors, and it happened to be a university here in the Twin Cities. And so in my experience of 12 years working at this charter school and going through those processes and, executing that contract and getting renewed and all the things that we had to do as a school, when I determined that it was time for me to move on from my role, I ultimately became the executive director of that school. when I decided to leave the school and pass the torch and was looking for a new job. There were a couple of interesting jobs out there that were in authorizing. And I thought to myself, well, I think I know something about this. And I ultimately got a job here in Minnesota, at an authorizer. It was called the Audubon Center of the North Woods, and it's now called Osprey Wilds. It's an environmental learning center. And what was very unique about here in Minnesota, nonprofit organizations can be charter school authorizers.
Interesting.
And these state sanctioned agencies or universities or nonprofits that authorize new schools. They evaluate schools. They ensure that they're meeting outcomes for kids and doing good things. They can potentially take action to close schools if the schools are not serving students. This particular authorizer was unique in the country in that we, as an environmental learning center, we required that schools advanced students' environmental literacy and their engagement in the natural world. So it was really a cool place to be. That authorizer still exists, and I moved on about 5 years ago when I came to NACSA. And now in my role, I support the work of authorizers nationally, helping them do great work so that kids have great options in their communities for school.
Based on what you were telling us about authorizers in Minnesota being able to be really any nonprofit and to actually have a specific area of interest, in your case, environment, how is that similar or different from how other states authorize charter schools?
Great question. Yeah, Minnesota is unique. Actually, there's 2 states in the country that allow nonprofit agencies to authorize, Ohio and Minnesota. In Minnesota, we've got about 12 different authorizers, a couple school districts, a couple universities, and the rest are nonprofits. Sort of a similar story in Ohio. In a place like New Jersey, the Department of Education is the sole authorizer. In a place like New York State, New York City, DOE authorizes schools, SUNY authorizes schools, and the state agency also, the State Department of Ed authorizes schools. So it's very different. In Michigan, it's a lot of universities. A number of states. California is very interesting. There's hundreds of authorizers in California because many school districts authorize schools. And it might just be, in many cases, they authorize 1 or 2 schools. And then you have LA, Los Angeles Unified School District, that might authorize 200 schools, charter schools. Yeah, so it's varied across states.
That's very interesting. And it actually does lead into what I was going to ask you next. So we're talking about charter schools. We're talking about authorization. So what exactly is authorization? What's involved in authorization? And why is it an important part of whether it's new school creation or to ensure the continued running of an existing charter school?
I would say just that. It's authorizers are the quality, ensure quality. That's their charge. Ensure that students have access to quality options. So if a guy like you or a guy like me engages with folks in our community and we decide our community seeks a new school and we have some ideas and we're working with our community to start a new school, we do that through an authorizer. Authorizers, again, through authority granted to them by their state legislatures, have developed applications that are asking you about your mission and your vision and your capacity. What's your program going to look like? What's the financial viability? How are you going to ensure that you have licensed teachers and provide strong special education programming and English and programs for English learners? All the different aspects of a school, and that you actually know what you're doing, right? Not any guy up the street can just run a charter school. So you have to demonstrate that you have the capacity to do this work as well. So through that application process and through that evaluation of not only the written application, which, to be honest, sometimes they're too long, but they're robust, they're long. And then through capacity interviews and really getting at the capacity of this founding team to establish and operate a school, authorizers, they have just such a an important role in ensuring communities have access to great schools. If they approve the school, and these authorizers, it's the boards of these agencies, it might be a charter school commission or the State Board of Education that is ultimately making these decisions. Once the school's approved, it typically has maybe a year and a half to dive deep into planning, make sure they have the appropriate facilities, start the hiring processes, more fully develop the curriculum, do all the things to be sure that they're ready to open. The authorizer provides support and ensures that they are ready to open. Authorizers and charter school boards enter into a contract, and that contract says, we're going to get great outcomes for our kids, and this is how we define what those great outcomes will be. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. What does quality mean? And it means a number of things. It means that kids are learning to read and write and do math. It means that kids are learning other things that are important depending on the type of school. If it's an arts-focused school, that kids are developing their creativity muscles. If it's a bilingual program, of course, they're learning to speak and read and write in different languages. And that students are well, and that this is a well-run organization that's financially viable, that's meeting compliance requirements and all these other things. And authorizers evaluate and assess that and monitor that over the course of the charter term or the contract term, typically 5 years. And at the end of year 4, at the beginning of year 5, we do this comprehensive evaluation to assess the extent to which the school is meeting all those targets and goals and expectations. They are doing right by kids in the community. They get renewed for another 5 years, perhaps. If they are not, other things can happen. There can be some sorts of interventions or other things. Of course, the ultimate, if the school is not serving the kids in the community, the school can be closed. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things at NACSA here. We talk about accountability, we talk about access, and we talk about autonomy. Charter schools have the autonomy to implement the types of programs, to use their time, their resources, and their staff in the ways they see fit. And they have to be accountable to great outcomes for kids. And they have to provide access to students. Charter schools are public schools at no cost to students, and they are open to all students. And so they cannot limit who attends their schools.
It's so empowering to hear that there are these options in school communities that might not have had these options. And you also make me think of asking you the following, and that is, and obviously I don't need any names, and obviously we're talking about creating schools of quality, but when you do have a situation, whether at NACSA or whether in your prior roles, David, when there is a school that's not cutting it, right, or not having the achievement results that we want to see, how do you handle that? Because that could be a really trying experience for the community, because in most cases, a school community still has been formed, even if the school is not of the quality that we would like.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a tough situation. In my experience as an authorizer here in Minnesota, I ultimately made the recommendation to my board in 2 instances to not renew a school, to not offer that new contract, and ultimately to close the school. In both cases, they were schools that we determined, based on all the evaluation and monitoring that we talked about, we're really doing a disservice to their kids and to their communities. And that's really hard. And understanding that at the same time, some families were saying, this is our school and we love this school. But a combination of things, the academic performance data demonstrated really poor outcomes. And I'm certainly including in that the statewide assessments, but I'm not only including the statewide assessments. And the school culture was complicated. We got a lot of complaints, for example, from parents, from teachers, from others. The level of governance was disconnected from what was happening in the school. There was no level of accountability for school leadership. So there was a lot of factors that that led to those decisions and those recommendations. And they're not easy, especially when that's happening in communities that haven't had great options. As an authorizer, it's critical that in those situations where you might be taking action to close a school, that you support families, you work with the families, and you work with the surrounding schools to help provide better options for them, because there are better options. It absolutely can be, in some ways, it's a challenge for families in some instances. And on the same token, that's part of the sort of this autonomy for accountability exchange, that we have to hold charter schools to high expectation to get great outcomes for kids, and we have to evaluate them fairly and see the kinds of options that we really want for our kids.
David, too, you were mentioning this before. You were mentioning that authorization comes in many shapes and many forms, depending on where the charter school is. I believe in what you were talking about before, you were also mentioning that in some instances, districts, traditional school districts, are involved in the process of authorizing charter schools. Now, in your position or in your experience, how does that work when that could be a challenging relationship?
It's interesting because there are just, some of the biggest districts in the country, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, authorized charter schools. And in some states, they've really, it ebbs and flows, and it's changed in some of these different places. But in some cities, in some districts, they see chartering as an opportunity to provide these different kinds of options to students, to provide different kinds of programming, Montessori programming, bilingual programming, arts-based programming, different kinds of school models. And in some cities, including some of these big districts I've mentioned, there's tension, as you allude to. In some places, they want to put a moratorium. They don't want more new charter schools. They're taking, the districts are struggling with lower enrollment. Resources are limited. The teachers' unions, all these different elements can come into conflict. And at the same time, we know that in many districts across this country, students don't have great options. And so even if there is this perceived actual enrollment challenges in some districts, that doesn't mean all kids have access to great schools. And so we can think differently about the creation of new schools and new models that are more responsive to community aspirations and community needs. We're seeing in Texas some really interesting things with district authorizing, and they refer to these partner schools that, again, are providing more autonomy, but they almost come a little bit more under the umbrella and under the wing of the district, and the district might be providing facilities and even transportation, but the operator and leader is given some autonomy over the curriculum and the educational program and the pedagogy. San Antonio's doing a lot there, and other districts, Fort Worth, and some of these smaller districts in rural Texas as well. So in some states, frankly, the law requires that the districts authorize, and in some states the districts embrace it. So it's all over the map.
What you were just saying also is going to inform my next question. You were saying that in a charter, often there is that opportunity to be innovative with the curriculum you choose, to choose your theme, if you will, and to have more authority to make those decisions. Obviously, having more autonomy, but then with autonomy comes accountability, of course, but having more autonomy could be seen as an advantage to working in a charter. For the teachers listening to this podcast, David, what would you say? And I know that this is very specific to the individual schools, but in general, what would you say would be some of the advantages, whether you're a teacher or an administrator, in working in a charter versus working in a more traditional, say, district type role?
I mean, you alluded to it, that it absolutely depends. You're in New York City, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And New York City has a lot of charter schools, some of which I visited. And some of those schools are very structured in terms of how their curriculum is implemented. And teachers have very little autonomy and might not have a lot of room to wiggle in terms of how they are delivering the curriculum. Now, in those schools, often, not always, but often, teachers are given a lot of support and they really develop their muscles as a teacher in the context of that program. I've visited other schools in New York and elsewhere that teachers have a lot of autonomy and a lot of room to bring their full creativity to bear, different sorts of, and these aren't necessarily unique to charter schools, but different kinds of pedagogies, project-based learning, or schools like Big Picture. There's a lot of those programs out east that integrate, more experiential learning, a lot of different kinds of programs. So I think that educators can find the type of program that gets them excited.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there's other great charter schools that have very structured curricula and very specific, and so it depends what you're looking for.
I like how you said that. So for the folks listening today to our podcast, I think the point that really is being made is whether or not a traditional school, or if it is a charter school, to be asking questions about what type of curriculum it has, how much autonomy does one have, how much autonomy does one want. So it really is important for folks, again, not to go in thinking, oh, this is a charter school, it's going to be operated this way, or this is a traditional district school and it's going to be operated that way, but really to be asking questions about whether or not there is that fit for you. So I appreciate you saying that, David.
Yeah, and I think it's equally important for students and families, right? And back to this concept of new schools, it's just critical that new school developers are connecting with their communities and listening and listening and listening to their communities. What does our community aspire to? What do they seek in a school? And how is this community actually part of the development of this new school? Not to mention the ongoing operation of a school. How do we get feedback from our families? How do we make sure the curriculum is really relevant to our kids? And so at those early stages of school development, that's critical, and at the ongoing development of schools as well. And so as you look for a school for your child, if there's not a new school developing, you look for those things like, how does my child learn? What kind of environment do I want? It's not only about arts programming or bilingual programming, but it's do I want uniforms? Do I want a flexible kind of learning environment? Do I want a very structured learning environment, right? All these different types of learning environments that are evident in charter schools and in many district schools as well. I think that the breadth and scope of the diversity of models in charters is probably a little broader than it is in most district schools.
And David, you pretty much you're leading me into my next to last question, which is who should be developing these schools? Because you mentioned there needs to be that community input into the process. So if there are folks listening out there, I started a magnet school myself. So it wasn't a charter school, it was a magnet. It was one of the best experiences I had in my life. Enjoyable, creative, really made me excited about being an educator. So I'm sure there are folks out there teachers out there thinking about, I want to start my own school. I want to have my own charter school. So to help them out, who should be starting these schools, and how can someone go about if they're a teacher somewhere and they don't know how to start a school or how to begin the process? So not only who should be creating these schools, but how can they start going about it?
Well, I'd start with saying you have to be a little bit nuts to start a charter school, because it is a lot of work. Maybe not nuts, but you have to be ready to work. And I say that in that the application and some of those steps we talked about earlier about applying to a charter school, engaging with the community, all that stuff is really a lot of work. And then actually opening and running the school and teaching is the hardest job you'll have, and running a charter school is, if you're the school leader, it might even be harder than teaching. So to put that out there, and it's, as you alluded to, it's rewarding and amazing. at the same time. I think we think that certainly I was a teacher. As I said, I was nothing special. I was a teacher, and one of my teacher colleagues and I, and as I alluded to, a couple artist colleagues, we had a vision for something different. And so I've talked to one of the people who comes to my mind is a mother who I talked to. Now, she happened to also run a nonprofit program. This is out in California. She ran a nonprofit program that like an after school program for girls. And she and some mothers in her community, they called themselves the Mom Squad. They wanted a different opportunity. They didn't love the educational opportunities they had in their community. And so they were actually trying to recruit someone like a charter school operator to come in and start a new school in their community. And they couldn't get anyone to bite. But as they were talking to one of those operators, they said, you know what, you guys, you all can, this Mom Squad can start your own school. And so they ended up essentially doing so. I mean, the school's scheduled to open next fall. And so it's got to be, I think, first of all, it's people, to your question of who, it's people who are part of, in many cases, or are listening deeply to communities and understanding what this community seeks and aspires to, and how their child's education is part of that. It's folks who have just deep, strong vision and mission for what they want to do. And also folks who are willing to be flexible in that. Just another example. Here's an example of this was in Tennessee, or is in Tennessee. An educator, a teacher, went to graduate school at Columbia and, all those kinds of things. Very highly educated guy. Went back to his community in East Tennessee and wanted to start a school. He was part of one of these incubator programs. And he wanted to start a STEM school, but he connected with his community. He listened to his community. He had all kinds of meetings and all kinds of conversations and talked to, scores of people. He learned that they actually wanted a bilingual Spanish-English immersion program. So he shifted everything he was thinking about because he listened to his community. He was from that community, although he had left, but he came back. But he was just really responsive and listening. And so I'm talking a little bit more about the characteristics of school leaders, but I think that's really critical. People who understand education and are effective instructional leaders. I mean, it's critical that charter schools have effective instructional leadership. And that's not enough. So you might be a great instructional leader, a teacher, a principal instructional coach. And if you have ideas about starting a charter school and your community, you're on the same page with your community, you also need to think about operations, right? So when you work in a school district, the district machine, if you will, worries about the facilities and worries about the buses and worries about, the PD and all these things. When you're a charter school operator, you worry about all those things as well. So you have to, it doesn't always have to be you, but you need to bring together a team that understands school finance and understands, navigating facilities and contracts and all those things, right? That's why I get to this point. It's a lot, right? There's a lot of things you need to.
Now, should folks reach out to their local authorizers if they are interested in starting a charter? Where can they turn?
Yeah, depending on the state you're in, there likely is like a charter school association. In Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Association of Charter Schools. In New Jersey, you have the New Jersey Association of Charter Schools. They might be called something different, but some version like that. That would be a great place to start. You can also, in your state, type in, Massachusetts charter schools, and you might also type in the word authorizer, so you can get a sense of who is the authorizer or who are the authorizers in my state. Once you find that out, you can go to their website and understand what's their timeline, what's their process. You can probably download the application or get an application, and don't think that you can write that application in a month. This is a long process, and just to underscore my point about connecting with your community, because at the end of the day, there is no school without students, and there is no money without students either to operate your school. And so you want the school to be what your community is wanting and needing, and so you need to develop this school with your community so that they ultimately enroll in your school. So there's incubator programs and other types of things, you might explore those kinds of programs as well. There's an organization called BES that has fellowship programs, for example, Charter School Growth Fund, New School Venture Fund. There's a number of these types of programs that are national, and there's some that are local. In Indianapolis, there's the Mind Trust. Depending on where you are, there's local support and national support for these fellowship types of programs as well. But think long, because it's not something you do from today till tomorrow. You have to have a long vision, a lot of persistence.
Yeah, and that gets back to your original point. It's a lot of work. You have to have that strong work ethic. Yes, you have to have that dream to create new options for students, but it isn't going to be a turnaround tomorrow kind of thing, that you need to be in it for the long haul.
And it's not a one person show either, right? You
Correct.
need a team. It's a team endeavor.
Yeah, and like you were saying before too, it's a team endeavor of people with different skills. The academic skills, the operational skills, the community development skills. So David, before we go, any last minute thoughts or comments for any of our listeners that we didn't get to?
Just to add one more thing to this last train of thought. I had the opportunity to meet with 5 school leaders in New York State, as a matter of fact, that have opened new schools within the last 2 years. And one of the things they said that was really valuable for them was talking to others who had been through the process, right? So finding those school leaders who applied for a new charter and opened a new charter to help. It can be a lonely business, and charter school leaders love to talk to other charter school leaders. So that's a place to be as well. But education is shifting, and we all experience huge changes. We can't go back to how education was 3 and 4 and 5 years ago. We want to, as parents, we got a window into school that we hadn't really seen before. And in many communities, they understand that we need school to be different for our kids. Excited for what that will bring.
Likewise, David. David, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.